Ha, we are live. All right. Welcome, everybody, to the Ranting and Rolling Lockdown podcast. The last time I did an episode, we weren't officially on lockdown yet. So this is a little different, trying to make sure that interaction can still happen in a meaningful way. I have the pleasure of having one of my former professors from, we won't say how long ago because that'll make us both feel old. When I first tried college, when I got out of high school, Kevin Ankeny, and he is the professor of broadcasting at SUNY Adirondack in upstate New York. Probably one of the people that has had the biggest impact on me as far as, my entertainment interests, I would say, because I know I look for different things as far as music and TV than I would have had I not taken those courses. I know that I didn't go into, that field as far as a career. But, I think that kind of was the jumping off point of helping me at least figure out where my comfort level was. So I'm grateful that you're here. And I mean, obviously I know that because of the lockdown, we were able to do this. Otherwise, I know you're relatively pretty busy because, you are very in demand, or at least I like to think you are.
This lockdown has changed a lot. Most of my courses, especially spring semester and especially the second half of spring semester, are very hands-on. We're in a TV studio, we're outside with video cameras and microphones. So it's been a challenge to transition everything to online. But I do want to mention that this is my first official guest appearance on a podcast. Podcasts have been around for 20 years, 15 years, I guess. This is my first one, so thanks for having me as a guest.
I'm honored to have you. I mean, and I'm honored that I was the first one. And like I told you when we were, discussing when it would be good to, meet up, I don't necessarily have the largest draw, but it's something I enjoy, and I hope that it, picks up. So I just want to have people that I'm comfortable with.
Right on. Yeah, well, I tell students all the time on the college radio station, whether you have an audience of 1 or 100 or 1,000 or 100,000, you still bring your A game and do the best show to keep that one person or that 100 people entertained. So that's what I'm here to help you with today.
I appreciate that.
Make it a good show. It's interesting. I probably know, I don't know, at least close to a dozen people who have podcasts, and none of them have ever asked me to be a guest. So first time, here we go.
I need to embrace the people that I find interesting and motivating. And the one thing, and I know obviously, my first attempt at college didn't really pan out the way I had hoped, but I think that you made an impact on me where I had gone through 12 years of, elementary and high school, or elementary, middle, and high school. And it was very, I want to say a little bit more structured, but when I met you, I kind of got the sense that you don't put yourself above your students. You joke around with them as if they are, like they are adults, because most of them are 18 and over. And you don't, I guess some would probably say you're an authority figure because you're an educator, but I get the feeling you don't see yourself as an authority figure.
Only when I have to be, I guess. My background, I worked in on-air radio for 10 years. So sometimes I think of being in the classroom as kind of an extension of being on the air. You're informing.
Mm-hmm.
As a radio host, you're on the same level as the audience. You're talking about things they're interested in, things they need to know about. And so when I came into the classroom, I kind of just, that was natural for me to be more like the host of the show as opposed to the instructor. And I think my personality, I tend to, I look for humor and ways to incorporate humor in everything I do. And I think that's why in the classroom, I think a lot of students relate to me because I'm just, that kind of quirky guy with a weird sense of humor. And now I'm old enough that students look at me sort of like another dad. There's just another dad joke. Oh my God, this guy with his dad jokes. But I'll tell you, a lot of students are just trying to figure it out right out of high school at 18 or 19 years old. And so they come to college and they choose a major that seems interesting. And some of them really embrace it and take off. And other people, after a semester or 2 semesters, decide to go in a different direction. But I think a lot of students that I've talked with, or former students, people that were students 10, 15 years ago, will point out a couple of things that they picked up from their time as a broadcasting student that they now use in their career in real estate or retail or customer service or car sales, or even, some people get into some field that's related to broadcasting, like advertising or public relations. And I think there's a lot just from being a student and interacting with other people that you develop skills, soft skills, the people skills that don't necessarily show up on a report card or in your grade, but that translate to careers years and years and years down the road.
Mm-hmm. I think I'm hearing myself on your end, or at least I was. Yeah, that's weird. Yeah.
Let me turn my volume down a little bit.
Okay.
How's that? Can
better?
You hear me now?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
And I can hear you. This should work out.
You had said, and you started out saying, that obviously this is the first podcast that you've been a guest on. Coming from a career in traditional radio, what are your thoughts on where the industry is currently, and are podcasts an enemy of traditional radio?
I think that was the philosophy as digital started and the web started. A lot of people in broadcasting and radio and television looked at this new medium of social media, the internet, as more of an obstacle or an enemy. But I think most broadcasters now have leaned into it. And if you think about what a podcast is, a podcast in most cases is the same thing as a radio show that people were doing in the 70s and the 60s and the 1940s and 1930s. It's just not delivered over the air in real time on a radio station. It's delivered either real time over the web, or it's recorded and archived and accessed by an audience when they're ready to listen to it or watch it. So I think the content of podcasts is really, it borrowed its form, you could say, from radio. And I think now the greatest thing that radio can do is lean into social media and digital and the web and podcasts, because I think back to my time in radio. Started, my first paid job was 1987 and continued until I went to graduate school in 1994. So about 7 or 8 years of on-air radio. And when I was on the air, my interaction with the audience ended when my show ended, unless, I ran into them in the grocery store. There was no interaction. And now a radio personality can interact on the air for 4 hours or 5 hours, and then interact on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter all night long, and even on vacation. When I worked in radio and I took a week of vacation, hey, I'm not here next week. have fun without me. I'll see you later. Now a radio personality can go on vacation and still connect with the audience and do, Instagram photos from the beach in North Carolina, or even do like some real live stuff on Facebook. And
Mhm.
the ability to engage the audience 24/7, no matter where you are, I think is just powerful, because people gravitate to radio because it provides something other than music. There's the personality aspect. And if
Mhm.
you're going to be a radio personality, you have to use all the tools in your toolbox. And that's not just the microphone in the studio, but it's Facebook and, all those other avenues that you can use. And so I think, my first mindset back in, I don't know, let's say 2000, 2001, as the internet was really growing, is I'm like, this is going to kill radio.
Mhm.
But now I think radio can harness that power, just like so many other businesses,
Mhm.
and build something that's way more. The bond between the listener and the person on the air is much greater than it that ever could be. So I
Yeah.
don't know. It's kind of cool.
You and I were talking before we went live about the fact that I didn't want to put a lot of information, like personal information about you in the description, because I didn't want people to, seek out how to contact you without your say so. But touching on what you said as far as radio personalities having constant contact with their listeners because of social media, um, in your opinion, on both the good and the bad, what are your opinions as far as how it can be intrusive on the radio personality? Because it seems to me like it eliminates the ability for the radio personality to have a personal life if they're constantly connected.
Um, I guess everybody has to find the balance of how much of their personal life they want to share in social media, and how
Mm-hmm.
much, even, how much of your personal life do you want to share when you're on the air.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to talk about very personal details, or you want to keep it at a kind of arm's length, if you will, with the audience? So I think radio people, anybody working in media, even actors, have always had to kind of figure out how they want their personal life to mesh or not mesh with their public life. And
Mm-hmm.
some people lean into it all the way, and they thrive on trying to be an ordinary person everywhere they go. And then there are the people, the celebrities, that have entourages, and they can't go anywhere unless their personal manager goes to the restaurant and checks everything out and gets a private table. And then other people just show up, and everybody's like, oh, look, there's Tom Hanks, but nobody bothers him because it's Tom Hanks.
Yeah.
So I think for anybody, finding that balance between personal life and your social media life is a very individual choice. And some people will share everything, and man, that's more than I ever wanted to know.
Yeah.
And then other people are, they just share what they're comfortable with. So I think for anybody who's on the air at a radio station, it's the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Some people use their
Um,
real names, and their names are in
yeah.
the phone book, or when phone books were a thing, they used their real name on the air, and their name was in the phone book, and wasn't a big deal. And then other people use a different name, maybe because it's catchier or more memorable,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't have a listed phone number, and everybody does it differently.
Yeah. Um, Speaking specifically about, back up in that area, you're obviously probably familiar with John Pratt and Sean Kelly.
Oh yeah, sure.
I actually worked for them through an internship while I was taking your class.
Mm-hmm.
And I think at the time it was a mix of me realizing that I kind of wanted to get away from the education system because I had just done 12 years of it, and getting thrown into having an internship at a radio station. I think that's what kind of scared me away from continuing to pursue it. Because and I don't know if he'll ever see this, but if he does, I don't know. I'm far enough away where it doesn't affect me. John was not the easiest person to work for. Like, he was intimidating. But the one thing that I didn't know about John until I started working for him is that his last name is not his last name. And I never realized until then that he used a different last name. Mm-hmm. Of course, Sean Kelly uses his real name. When I was growing up, I don't know if you were in the area early enough to remember this, DJ. Do you remember a station? I don't think it's still around. WENU.
Yeah.
There was a DJ on there in the late '80s and into, I think, the mid '90s. Jay Scott.
Yes.
I did not know until I was in high school that he was using his middle and last name. I never knew that because I guess my mom knew him personally. Mm-hmm. So she knew that he was using his middle and last name, but it shocked me. And that's what started making me realize that, like, people in the entertainment world, whether you're a radio DJ or, you know, an actor or an actress, or even a musician, you know, you find ways to improvise so that you can maintain some sort of anonymity. And it was a really cool learning experience to know how people manage their personal lives as opposed to their professional lives.
Right. I'll share this kind of a funny story. The first radio station I worked for, I was on the air midday, so 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. Mm-hmm. And a couple of days in a row, a state trooper called the on-air studio, and I answered the phone, and he was asking for a woman. And I said, "I'm sorry, there's nobody that works here by that name." And then he would call back the next day and same question, asking for a woman. And we don't have anybody. I mean, there are only like 4 women that work at this radio station. I know all of them, and none of them are that name. And then later that day, I said to the program director, whose name I thought was Casey O'Day, I said, "Casey, this state trooper keeps calling and asking for this woman by name, first name and last name, and I have no idea what she said, "You idiot, that's me." Like, what? That Casey O'Day's not your name? She goes, "No, you moron." Yeah. Just assumed, you know, but what's funny is I wasn't using my real last name. I was using Evans. Kevin Evans was my radio name most of the places I worked, but it never dawned on me that anybody else was changing their names.
That's funny. I think when I was interning, because I was interning at The Point, and I think when I was there, I wasn't on air over there because I hadn't actually had any on-air experience through classes yet. So they didn't want to put me on air, which I understood. We were throwing around different names that I could have gone by, and they wanted to use my first and middle name. It's like, I don't know if I'm comfortable with that because too many people already know me in that area. So it wouldn't be hard for them to determine who I was. And that's one of the problems with being too well known in that in an area, is you don't really have the ability to have any privacy. So I think that was another thing that scared me away from being that much of a public figure. I don't think at the time I wanted to be any sort of public figure.
Yeah. The one interesting kind of fun, it was actually pretty entertaining. So I worked at a radio station near Erie, Pennsylvania. Northwestern mm-hmm. Pennsylvania has a pretty large Amish Mennonite population. Mm-hmm. And my wife and I were in Walmart one evening, you know, picking up paper towels and motor oil and all the weird things you buy at Walmart. And there are a whole bunch of little Amish girls like walking down the aisle, and then they would giggle, and then I'd turn around and they would disappear. And this went on for a couple of minutes. And then I think it was my wife overheard one of them say to the other one, "I think that's Kevin Evans." And so I had my own little bunch of groupie Amish girls following me around. And so it turns out that a lot of the Amish teens and even preteens have battery powered radios, and they listen to the radio, even though it's not approved by their culture. Kids are rebels no matter what their religion, or they're going to do things that their parents say they shouldn't do. And so one of the big things was listening to country radio out in the barn or wherever the chicken.
I think when the Amish venture out on their own to see if they want to leave the faith, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's called Rumspringa.
Yep. Yeah.
Yep.
Exactly.
Okay. Because there was a TV show. I don't know if it's still on. It was called Breaking Amish, and it was fascinating to watch that show, just because of you only hear about certain things from certain people because of their level of knowledge of it. So to have that resource to learn more about that culture, it was fascinating to me.
Mm-hmm.
As far as the age of podcasts, I'm curious, are there any podcast shows that you specifically listen to, or do you stick to strictly radio still?
Actually, the only podcast that I listen to on a semi-regular basis is, and I just blanked on the name. Give me a second. Oh man, don't get old, dude. This is what happens when you get old. It's hold on, I gotta yell at my wife. She's downstairs.
Okay.
So what's the name of that podcast? Lore? Yeah, there we go. It's called Lore, Lore.
Okay.
And it's the guy's a great storyteller, but there are all kinds of legends or lore all over the world about sometimes it's this is the one that actually got me hooked. In Key West, Florida, my wife and I have been to Key West a number of times. Really like the area there, and there is a doll, like a big rag doll. His name is Robert, and he's in a museum there in Key West because he was in a home that, and allegedly this doll is possessed or has some kind of lifelike quality, because he was the doll of a young child, and people in a wealthy family, and the people who worked in the home, the cooks and people who cleaned, would all quit because the doll would scare them. And you would hear this. I mean, people would say they would hear a child's voice even after the young kid had grown up and moved away, that they would hear this doll from outside the house. And it was just seeing the doll and hearing that story was interesting. But then somebody mentioned that they had heard a podcast about it, and my wife and I actually looked for it and found it. And so occasionally we still listen to the Lure podcast, but that's really the only one. I'm kind of old school. I like my interesting content coming out of a little box with an antenna on top of it.
I'm trying to think. I just blanked on something too.
See, it's contagious.
Being that, I would say the major difference between podcasts and traditional radio is, and it might be a similarity and a difference. You know how obviously certain stations only play certain genres of music, and podcasts seem to be very niche in the sense that there are podcasts for everything. But would you say, in your opinion, that podcasts are more kind of recorded, non-visual? Well, this is visual now, but for in general, like talk shows or kind of interviews?
I think a lot of podcasts people tell me about, or that I've seen a little bit about, tend to be a couple of people in conversation, whether it's a host and guest or two or three co-hosts. One of my colleagues at the college, he and some of his friends have a podcast and a website. It's the Brotherhood of Evil Geeks. And so they're all about comic books and Marvel movies and all that kind of stuff. So obviously a very, very specific target audience and a very specific topic.
I'll
But
have to
they
check
all
them out.
kind of like co-hosts, and occasionally they'll have a guest, but it's more of a roundtable discussion like you would have with two or three buddies on a Friday night or whatever. And so there are podcasts that are like that, and then there are the podcasts that are a host and a guest. And my friend Phil Kahn has a podcast.
I know Phil. I'm very familiar.
Yeah, it's Phil's pop culture podcast.
Wow, I did not know he had one.
Yeah, and
I miss that guy.
He's great, and his podcast is interesting. I think he got the idea because every year he would go to a convention in New Jersey that featured a lot of people who were actors in TV shows in the 1970s and 1980s, but have kind of fallen off the radar.
I go to a lot of Comic-Cons. I actually went to my first one right after I moved out of New York. It was Wizard World Comic-Con Nashville, and I met so many people. So yeah, I frequent them a lot.
So from his experience going to this convention every year, people started to remember him. And like Lou Ferrigno and people like that. And so
I've met Lou.
He got this idea of maybe I just ask them if I can interview them, and I think that began the podcast. And then he said, what do I have to lose? I'll send an email to this person or that person and see if I can get them to do a short conversation with me. And he was surprised at the people that would respond. Yeah, sure, why not? Stand-up comedians and people who've written books and people who were child actors who are now in their 50s and 60s. Kind of cool.
Yeah.
But yeah, Phil's never asked me to be on his show.
Well, okay, I have a one-up on Phil. That I can put that in my resume.
There you go.
Yeah, my mom was close to Phil for a number of years. So yeah, Phil and I are very familiar with each other. I'll have to reach out to him. As far as people kind of in the entertainment industry, when you had your career in radio, was there anybody that you can specifically remember meeting? Like anybody that you never really thought you'd cross paths with?
A few. Most of my radio career was in country radio. So, and that was in the early to mid 90s when country music had just blown up. The Nashville network in Nashville was on cable television, and country music television was playing music videos all day long. And country radio, in some markets where there had never been a country radio station, now there were 2 and 3, and even Pittsburgh, where I grew up, had one country radio station for 20 years. And then in the early 90s, at one point, there were 3 or 4. So I met a lot of the big stars of that time, like Clint Black, Lori Morgan, Alabama a couple of times, Charlie Daniels. I think probably the coolest person I think might have been Charlie Daniels, because he's just a very genuine person. And he performed. He had been kind of under the weather, and I think he had a kidney stone, and he was also probably in his late 50s or early 60s at that point. And he played for 2 hours without an intermission, just 2 straight hours. Wow. And then after the show, he was in no hurry to get on the bus and go anywhere. And he could have just hung out and told stories all night long. And I think his band at that time had been with him for a long time. So there was a real kind of family connection. And it wasn't like like the big rock star backstage parties that you would think. This guy was really down to earth. So that might've been maybe one of the best. And then Ricky Van Shelton, who was a Country Music Association Entertainer of the Year, saw him at an outdoor festival, and we drank some wild turkey on his bus after the show.
Awesome.
That was cool. Yeah.
It was short lived, but there was a music festival here in Roanoke. It was called the Blue Ridge Music Fest, and it was primarily all country artists. And I got the chance to see Charlie live. I didn't get the chance to meet him, but I got the chance to see him, Brad Paisley. Are you familiar with Brantley Gilbert?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I got to see him, and I actually got to meet him personally. Just so many people. I wish they had actually kept the festival here, but I think it just got too expensive to run it. But it's amazing the number of people, because they always say, or at least I've always heard, don't meet your heroes because you're probably going to be disappointed. I've actually been more surprised that they are more down to earth than they appear on stage or on TV. That's what shocked me. And I think it's the class of entertainers, because like you said, there's a differentiation between country artists and people in the rock and roll world. There's a personality difference, and it really is great to see so many of these people willing to embrace those who support them.
Right. Yeah, I think if you watch the PBS documentary in the fall about country radio, country radio and the country music industry all kind of grew up together. So I think even today's country artists, and I think we can even have a whole podcast about if today's country music is country music or pop rock country. But I think even the new country artists still have a connection to the past in country music. And the Grand Ole Opry continues to be an attraction. And it started in the 1920s. It's the longest running weekly radio show, the Grand Ole Opry live from Nashville. So I think a lot of country artists still recognize their roots, go back to a very smaller, humbler time where everybody in the industry lived around Nashville. And Nashville was the epicenter of country music, but it's where everybody lived. And so it was more of a community than, say, rock and roll, which was happening on the West Coast and the East Coast and all over the country.
Yeah. Now, I don't think I'm going to age either one of us by asking this question, but I know you're probably not old enough to remember this era of radio, but I'm sure that learning about radio, you're obviously familiar with the old shows that they used to have on radio, like the Lone Ranger.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
Do you think that with the popularity of podcasts that we might see that come into popularity again, like shows like that?
I don't think so.
No?
And I only say that because even before podcasting, radio had gotten away from that type of entertainment, dramas and comedies. And I think because television, the visual of television, it's cool to listen to the Lone Ranger, but to see the Lone Ranger, oh man.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, by the time, I was born in 1966. So radio was music intensive, news intensive, and had gotten away from soap operas and crime dramas and comedies and things like that. But in talking with my grandparents, they realized that television changed radio. They say video killed the radio star, and kind of the radio stars just moved to television. James Arness, who was Marshall Dillon in Gunsmoke,
Mm-hmm.
started in radio and then moved to television.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there's always going to be a niche, a small group, an audience who wants old time radio dramas and things like that. But as far as like a resurgence of that kind of stuff, I think the people who have money to invest and produce it are doing it for Netflix and Amazon Prime. And so I think that's where the growth in storytelling is happening.
Mm-hmm. Going back to what we were talking about previously about whether podcasts are competition for traditional radio, jumping more into the music aspect of it, do you think streaming services are competition for radio?
Oh, absolutely. I think anything that we can look at and hear
Mm-hmm.
is competition for radio. People
Mm-hmm.
listen to radio for entertainment and information, and we obviously know that we can get entertainment and information 100 other places. So,
Mm-hmm.
Every form of media is competing with all the other forms, and to say that radio isn't competing with television or isn't competing with online content or streaming media is, I think programmers who think their only competition is the other radio stations in town are missing. They're probably losing the battle because they don't
Mm-hmm.
realize where their audience is when they're not listening to the radio station. So yeah, I think for sure. And you think about how much money we spend now on media. Some people are paying for cable TV or satellite TV, plus Netflix, plus Hulu, plus Amazon Prime, plus Disney Plus. I mean, at least radio is still free.
Yeah.
Satellite radio, there's a fee, but but then there's also, all of the music streaming like Pandora and Spotify. YouTube has music channels.
Mm-hmm.
But radio still has its place because, for now at least, radio is still king in the car. 80%. This is according to Nielsen. 80% of adult Americans listen to radio at some time in their car. And so maybe the real twist is going to be that this pandemic, where everybody is at home, could start rapidly changing our use of media. Because I don't think people are going, you know what, I'm going to go out and sit in the car for an hour, listen to the radio. I miss that. They're filling their time with other content. Will they go back to it when they get in the car, when they resume daily life and going to work and those kinds of things? Probably. But, it could be the beginning of major change.
Yeah. And one of the things that actually just popped into my head, I was taking a trip with a friend of mine last summer, and we were going from where I am in Virginia down to Atlanta for a Comic-Con that was down there. And instead of listening to the radio, because as you know, driving from, location to location, certain radio stations can kind of fall out of signal.
Mm-hmm.
So what we were doing is we were using my phone, and we were listening to Spotify because it got a constant data signal. So there was no dropout of, oh my God, we're listening to a rock station, but okay, now we're in Nashville, Tennessee, and that rock station has turned into country. And so it's not a matter of having to switch to find, the type of music that you were listening to. You can just continuously listen to it through, like you said, either Spotify or I actually use iTunes Music, which I love. I mean, I've had a subscription with iTunes for years, so it was just kind of natural for me to continue using the iTunes radio. It shocked me. I got to thinking, it's like, okay, I remember taking short trips because until we actually moved out of New York in 2013, I never took a trip, at least in the car, outside of New York. So, listening to radio on long trips was never really a thing because, I mean, I think it stands to say that everything in New York is kind of a hop, skip, and a jump away, and because it's such a small area. But yeah, it got me thinking when we were going from Virginia to Georgia, and we weren't actually listening to the radio, and it's like I wonder what my grandparents would think about not listening to the radio, because that was something that, I mean, they traveled up until I think my grandmother was 80, and they were always listening to the radio. I don't know if people like them could have gotten used to listening to a streaming service. And
Yeah.
it made me question how willing people are to adapt. And I think after this whole experience that we're having right now, like you said, I wonder how many people are going to be willing to adapt, because I don't think we can go back to the way we behaved previously, because we are entering a new phase of normal. Like, what we knew before is not going to be normal anymore. And
Right.
it just, I have to wonder, you know, just like with any industry, if people are going to be able to adapt and evolve to continue.
Sure. I think things are always changing, and because we're only looking at like what's right in front of us, we forget about what's happened in the past. But think about, oh my God, we used to ride bicycles without helmets, and now, or even skiing, right? I
Yeah.
mean, nobody wore a helmet skiing, and now you go to any ski center, and
Mm-hmm.
almost everybody's wearing a helmet. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so, yeah, as things open up again and we get back to daily life as we would like it to be, there are going to be some things that change for sure. I could imagine in the future all international travel flights coming into and going out of the United States. It's going to be kind of standard procedure to take somebody's temperature before they get on a plane.
Mm-hmm.
We live in our culture, our world is so interconnected that you can wake up in China and have breakfast, and then you can have lunch in France, and then have dinner in New York City because you're traveling.
Mm-hmm.
And then once you're in New York, you're in contact with hundreds of people, and then you take the train home to upstate New York, and you've just been all across the world in 24 hours. Obviously, any type of infectious disease is capable of spreading faster than ever before. The good news is we have the science and the technology, and most countries have the financial resources to better prepare to meet these challenges. So I don't think we're going to live in a world where we're always going to have to wear masks and be 6 feet apart from each other. But I think there will be some things that change. Anywhere you have large groups of people, maybe expect to have some type of a screening to check your temperature. I mean, seems like, why weren't we doing that all the time, especially during flu season? Like, holy cow. It's so easy. You get on a plane with 140 people and fly to Florida. In that 4-hour flight, you could easily infect a dozen people with the flu. So I think we'll be at a point where our new normal will involve more protocol, and maybe there will be more hand sanitizing stations everywhere you go, and those kinds of things. But we'll get back to regular life at some point, and listen to the radio and bitch about other things like the weather.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They do a lot of that down here in Virginia. Like, people are really afraid of the weather down here. Like, obviously coming from upstate New York, living down here, you hear a Virginian that was born here talking to somebody who's a transplant. You talk about the weather, you say the word snow, and they have a meltdown. Like, no pun intended, they have a meltdown. Like, they freak out. Whereas obviously, you and I, we don't flinch until there's more than 2 feet.
Right. Yeah.
And
Virginia, 4 inches of snow shuts the city down in Virginia. In upstate New York, they don't even start plowing until there are 6 inches of snow.
I remember a lot of times complaining to my mom that we had over a foot of snow and they still made us go to school. Like they didn't call school off. And it used to just irritate the crap out of me. And it definitely, I definitely changed my thought process when I was driving myself to school when it came to going to ACC, or SUNY Adirondack is now. Do people still call it ACC?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
People who work there, who have worked there for a long time, still call it ACC. People in the community, and it's both. I mean, your diploma when you graduate says Adirondack Community College still to this day.
Wow.
SUNY Adirondack is the informal name of the college. It's really based on marketing as opposed to the official name. The seal of the college, the little logo of the college that you would find on your transcripts says Adirondack Community College.
Oh wow.
Yeah. So we're both. Some
Yeah.
days we're more ACC and other days we're more SUNY Adirondack.
Now, I don't think I heard this until I was in my 20s, but is it true that people call it Harvard on the Hill? Have you ever heard anybody refer to it as that?
Yeah, Harvard on the Hudson, Harvard on the Hill. I think Hudson Valley Community College was referred to more often as Harvard on the Hill because it's on the hill above the river in Troy.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, I've heard people refer to Bay Road Tech.
Yep.
Or
I think when we were in high school, we used to. I think a lot of us as high schoolers called it America's crappiest college.
I know people refer to ACC as all can come.
Yeah, which is probably how I got in because I had garbage grades in high school.
Yeah. Well, I think the role of community colleges or open enrollment colleges that you don't have to take a placement test to get in, they're super, super important in our world because not everybody is a top-notch student and really motivated when they're 13, 14, 18 years old.
Yeah.
And those colleges that are less expensive that allow you to start over, a lot of students really flourish and sometimes not on their first try. Right now, I've got two students, both are in their mid-30s. Both of them, one was a student in like 06, 07. The other one was around 2010, 2011. Both of them took some time off. Both of them had other occupations. Both of them got married. Both of them own houses. And both of them are back in school to finish their degrees because they've grown up. They've figured some things out in life. They're better at managing their time and, self-discipline. And some people have it right away at 17 or 18. And some of them, they're 27 or 37 before they get it. So that's one of the cool things about where I teach is I can have an 18-year-old sitting in the front row right next to a woman who has raised two children who are now, the kids are in their 30s. And this woman has finally got a chance to do her own thing. And, she never went to college because she was raising a family. And now she's got the time and she wants to do it. And so you've got a very different dynamic. And our college particularly has a lot of people who are veterans. So, they're in their 20s and 30s and sometimes even older. And that adds a whole different perspective because you've got, somebody who's never been more than 50 miles from home sitting next to someone who's been in, Afghanistan or some other place in the world. It makes a very interesting engagement with students because everybody has a different experience. And now because we have housing on campus, we're getting a lot of students from downstate and from out of state. And so you get kids from Brooklyn and Queens, with a kid who's never been outside of like Hudson Falls, Queensbury, maybe Albany is the farthest they've ever been. And that dynamic is, everybody learns something in that kind of situation. So that's the one thing I miss now about, just being at home all day is I love my wife and she loves me, but one of the things I posted on Facebook is she's mad at me because I'm calling my soulmate my cellmate. I think we're both getting a little bit on each other's nerves.
Yeah.
And so I miss the interaction. One of the things I really liked about being on the air and radio was the ability to go out in the community, do a live broadcast from a car dealership or the county fair, and be face to face with people. And that's what I really liked about teaching. And now that's kind of been taken away. And I'm doing, sometimes we do some Zoom chats, or I talk to some people on the phone. But I've never thought of myself as like a social butterfly, but I do miss even just being on campus and seeing people, the people I see in the dining hall at lunchtime, or the cleaners or the custodians that I just have a very brief conversation with every day. I miss that because that's what makes us different from animals, is the ability to talk and communicate and share our feelings and our ideas. So
yeah,
I miss it.
Yeah, I think one of the things I've learned throughout this whole lockdown process is I find there's more, there's like people themselves give off a certain energy. And I think you feel that energy when you're, physically next to them. But I think that energy is missing, that type of energy is missing when all you're able to resort to is like video chats. So
Right.
I think that there's a level of energy that we're so used to as far as interaction. And with that level of energy being absent right now, it's like we're trying to find a replacement for it, even for, a temporary fix.
Absolutely. College campuses are a great example of the energy you talk about. The fall semester, everybody comes up high energy and they're excited to be back in school. And then, because in the Northeast, at least, it gets dark early and the weather gets worse and worse, the energy level just drops and drops and drops. And by the time you get to like Thanksgiving break and you're 3/4 of the way done with the semester, students are really just struggling to hang on, just emotionally and in terms of energy. And the spring semester is the opposite. We come back in January, we've had a break, so everybody's kind of like, yeah, let's get back to this. This is new, but the energy drops again very quickly until mid-March, and then the energy just picks up and picks up and picks up again because the weather is better, there's more sunlight, the end is coming, and you're transitioning to summertime where you've got 4 months of a different regimen. You're not in school all day, you're working or whatever. And I know exactly what you're saying. The energy, even sometimes there's a student who's just like super positive and always in a good mood. And as soon as they hit the door, every other student in the room just kind of perks up a little bit. And when that student isn't there, the room is just a little more mellow.
Yeah, their absence is more noticeable than their presence oftentimes.
Right.
Just because their presence is so common that their absence is very recognizable. Before we switch mediums, because I want to talk a little bit about TV as well. Do you think with the evolution of, the entertainment world and how we get our entertainment, in all honesty, do you think that traditional radio has a shelf life? Does it need to have a shelf life so that it can allow for other things to come in and, be its improvement?
I really think that AM radio, the AM radio band, has a shelf life for a number of reasons. The two biggest are the audience for AM radio is shrinking because it's an older audience and senior citizens die. But also the technology of AM radio, it doesn't sound as good as FM. The signal now, there's so much wireless interference that affects AM radio that it's really difficult at times to listen to AM radio, particularly outside of the home. If you're in a moving car, there are just too many challenges. And the radio industry itself and the Federal Communications Commission have really kind of ignored AM radio for a long time. So, think of like two house plants right next to each other on the same windowsill, and one of them gets enough water and enough sunlight, and the other one isn't watered as often and it's in the shadow more, and they're just growing differently. That's what's happening to AM radio. So I think AM radio probably, I don't know if my lifetime, but I would say probably the next 50 years, AM radio will probably evaporate. It might be a good thing. I think FM radio will continue to exist. I think it's probably going to form more strategic partnerships with other types of media to be able to do it. And radio will be more of a promoter of other avenues of entertainment and information. So I could certainly see some kind of a synergy where local news, the physical printed newspaper may go away, but there will still be a local organization reporting news through websites, and local radio will play a bigger role in promoting that and making it work. And that's maybe where, the podcast thing might come about, is people coming from radio who have the interview skills and all of those kinds of technical skills to do audio can partner with other community members to create podcasts that are specific to their community. And it might be on the radio station's website. It may never actually air on the radio, but radio has a tremendous power to promote. In a lot of cases, commercials just direct you to where to get more information. Go to the website and do this, or Google this and click on the link, or see our ad in the phone book. I mean, that's kind of a dated example. So I think broadcast radio is still going to be around. It certainly doesn't have the number of people working in it. The little radio stations in this area in the 1970s had employees reaching 30 and 40 employees, full-time people. And now most of those same radio stations have 4 or 5 full-time employees. So I think radio will continue to exist. It'll have a smaller employment possibility, but it's going to just continue to be part of all of that mix. Radio as the king form of entertainment is, that was the 1920s and the 1930s, 1940s. Television took over in the 1950s. The internet took over in 2000 or so. And now I think all of those will have to continue to exist together. And I'll just mention this, that no form of mass media has ever died because a new form was introduced. When the oldest form of mass media is books, they're still around.
Yeah.
Radio didn't kill newspapers. Television didn't kill radio. The internet hasn't killed any of that stuff yet. It's changed, certainly. Network television, I don't have to sit in front of my TV at 8 o'clock on Monday night to watch my favorite show. I can watch it the next day online, or I can stream it a year later on Hulu. So everybody's just trying to figure out how to fit into this new puzzle. And I think radio has been figuring it out. Will continue to figure it out.
Yeah. So you think that they have the ability to evolve? They just have to have the desire to do so.
Yeah, I think somebody has to be able to see a financial reward in doing it. I mean, radio is a business, and as much as somebody loves radio, if they can't find a way to make money from it, then they'll never go in that direction.
Right.
I mean, because that's the radio's a business.
Yeah.
And I think most people working on the business side of radio are looking at the future trends and how to continue to exist in a landscape. Maybe the biggest challenge right now for radio is in the car, because radio used to own the dashboard. There was radio and either a cassette player or a CD player. Now you can plug in through USB. There's satellite radio. they call it the connected car or the connected dashboard. So your display in your car is no longer just your radio. It's so many other forms of media. And radio is still going to have to figure out where its place is and all of that. But I think it will, for sure.
Jumping to TV,
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, especially, and I think it's very relevant with everybody being on lockdown. I think a lot more people are consuming a lot more TV or streaming services. I'll go within probably the last 20 years just to kind of keep it current. What are your thoughts on the state of the television industry of the last 20 years? Specifically, do you think that, well, maybe within the last 8 to 10 years, I think that this is more relevant, but do you think that injecting so much politics or social justice stuff into TV shows that weren't written for it is detrimental, or do you think that there is a way to do it effectively?
I think it goes back to maybe the first thing I ever learned as a journalism student or a broadcasting student, and that is know your audience.
Mm-hmm.
The writers for TV shows certainly have their own social, political views.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes the producers of the shows are really open to all of those views being built into the show. One way I can kind of relate it is the television show MASH,
Mm-hmm.
sitcom on CBS for more than a decade. Started out as a sitcom based on some wacky characters in the Korean War.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just a half hour of lighthearted comedy. And as the show progressed and had a very big following, the plot lines, every episode seemed to have more of a lesson or a moral story. And it got kind of preachy in its last years, but people still loved it. And so I think if a show can establish itself and the characters are still, the viewers identify with the characters and enjoy the show, you can start to incorporate things that are maybe, very, very political driven or perspective driven,
Mm-hmm.
and succeed. But if the show itself, if the characters aren't likable or relatable, the plots don't work, then it doesn't matter what you do with the show. I mean, Happy Days, remember the Fonz jumped the shark? And that term from that episode where Fonzie jumps over a shark on water skis or on his motorcycle or whatever, that became the standard when the show was done and like, it's time to end this and put this show out of its misery. They would say it has jumped the shark. So I think if a show isn't doing well, it doesn't matter what kind of contrivances you try to pull into it to make it survive or revive it. It's just not going to survive. And people have, Howard Stern said that's why there's a button on your radio. That's why you can change the channel or turn it off. So I think, we live in a world now. I mean, just look at Facebook. I mean, it's like alternate universes. Click on this person's page and it's very conservative right wing, and then click on this person's page, it's very left leaning, liberal, and they're commenting on exactly the same thing, but their perspectives are 180-degree opposites. So I think television is going to have to figure out either how to still play down the middle, or every network is going to have to decide if they want to be left leaning or right leaning, and then there will be a whole bunch of people like me in the middle going, oh, I guess I'll listen to the radio.
I've found because of the social environment we are in, I've found that as far as social and political, I'm more moderate because I can appreciate things from both perspectives. Like I'm sure you remember Full House and Family Matters. Do you remember those two TV shows? they had Full House from, I think, something like 88 to 96. And then at the end, towards the end of Full House, they put on Family Matters. Family Matters was, Full House obviously was an all-white family. And then you get Family Matters, it's an all-black family. But the thing that I loved about those shows, because I connected to those characters, with both shows. But the thing I loved about those shows is that it was never about immutable characteristics. It was always about the type of character they were. And I think that there's too much focus today in TV and sometimes in movies where they think that these immutable characteristics, like, somebody's skin color, somebody's gender, that's not something that, you can necessarily change. And I know I'm probably going to get dragged for saying you can't change your gender, but, I'll leave that to whoever's going to drag me. But it's like, I would rather connect with a character based on their personality and their thoughts versus what they look like and, how they behave. Like, obviously how they behave is going to, change how I interact with them, but it's like these characteristics that don't mean anything. I think they're putting too much focus on them.
Yeah, but again, remember, television is a visual medium, so what we see in a lot of ways becomes our reality. And so television, I think, is trying to broadcast TV, still trying to play to a broad audience. The Netflix original shows. I would say, Netflix and HBO and Amazon have really raised the bar in terms of programming, because it's not three networks anymore. It's not ABC, NBC, CBS. And there aren't just 20 production companies out there pitching ideas to three networks.
Right.
If ABC, NBC, they don't want it, go talk to Netflix. If Netflix doesn't want it, go talk to HBO. If HBO doesn't want it, go talk to, somebody who's a multimillionaire and has some rich buddies and they're looking for, a way to spend their money. Or produce it yourself and put it on YouTube and get 100,000 people to watch it, and then go back to the network and say, look, this worked. So I think the quality of content is better than it's ever been. People are constantly telling me about shows on Netflix that I've never heard of, and then I'll watch an episode and go, wow, now I know what I'm going to be doing for the next 5 weeks, 3 episodes a night. There's just so much content out there, and there are people who are making great things. If you have time, Google Greg and Donnie. Okay. Greg and Donnie. There are a couple of guys. That's not their real names.
Right.
They're characters that they created. They're 2 guys from Western Pennsylvania, area where I grew up, and they just got these zany characters, and they've been writers for different types of shows. One guy now lives in Brooklyn, I think, but they've got a big following, and I think at some point they've both had some small acting roles in network TV shows and on cable television shows. They're just really talented, and they're not the only ones. There are hundreds of people, thousands of people like them. And I think everybody's just looking for that in. And I think because it's not just 3 networks anymore, and it is so many different platforms, I think we're going to continue to see really great content. And I think viewers expect it now. Like, yeah, there's 31 episodes of this series. I'll watch 2 or 3, and if you don't have me sold by episode 2 or 3, I'll never get all the way to number 31, because I can go to my list and I got 40 more shows that people have recommended. So I think we're in a time where the content is great, but we have to think of it outside of just television. We've got to think about it, watching it on a tablet, on a laptop, on your phone. And, at some point, maybe, video chips implanted in our heads so we could just close our eyes and watch it.
Yeah, I had heard, I don't know how logical it is. I had heard something about what do you call them? Contacts. Like they created contacts where you can have information filtered into these contacts. It's like that's just nuts. Like because technology can be hacked, and you don't want something that's on your eye to be hacked,
right?
Because it can harm you. And it's crazy what these people want to develop so that they can constantly be receiving some sort of entertainment media. But to dial back to something you said about Netflix and the shows that are available on there, obviously, I'm guessing you're familiar with Double H Ranch up in Luzerne.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
Because I am a former camper from there, a friend of mine, she's a former lead singer of a band that played in Massachusetts. She obviously knew my connection to Double H, and she turned my attention to this show on Netflix called, and it's something that I would come up with really with my sense of humor. It's called either Crip Camp or Camp Crip, and it's a documentary about a camp that existed from the 50s to the 70s up in the Catskills, actually. And I was absolutely fascinated with this show. And because it chronicles from, when people were starting to be able to not have to be put in institutions, and all the way up to when this camp was created so that, people with medical special needs could really explore what they were capable of. And it goes all the way up to when George H.W. Bush signed the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. And there was so much leading up to that I never knew about. I really could watch that documentary at least once a week and learn something new from it.
Mm-hmm.
It fascinated me. And I love, because everything now costs money, and I'm sure that's why it took them so long to be able to create that documentary, because they had to have somebody who was willing to pay the amount of money it would take to create something like that. But I love the fact that the streaming services are offering things like that.
Right.
The Disney Plus right now they have obviously because Disney now owns Marvel, they have a show on Disney Plus called the Marvel's Heroes Project. And a lot of the episodes of the Marvel's Heroes Project are kids with special needs. And it's fascinating to me, and I love it.
Yeah, you think about independent films and documentaries mm-hmm. that would have been screened for a few audiences, maybe 1,000 people in 10 different theaters, and now they're on Netflix, and hundreds of thousands of people are watching them. I think we could definitely say that the internet, and then all of the platforms that are built from the internet, all the social media and streaming services, have really made the media a democracy again, democratized the media. Because mm-hmm. in the 1970s, the media was owned by a lot of companies, but still in your hometown, there were 3 TV stations and there were 8 radio stations or 20 radio stations. And that was your access to the whole world. Mm-hmm. And of course, local newspapers and national magazines. But now there are unlimited channels and, video channels we haven't even heard about that exist all over the world. Mm-hmm. And people who couldn't find a platform for their message can find it. And I think Netflix is a great example of independent filmmakers who are getting their stuff in front of big audiences that otherwise, maybe 1,000 people at 10 different film festivals would have seen, and then it would have just, the documentary would have just disappeared.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought I would have more time during this stay-at-home order to actually dig deeper into Netflix, but the amount of work I have to do to keep all my classes going online is, I said the other day, it's twice as much work for me, but the students are still doing the same amount, or in some cases even a little less work. So it's been a challenge. Hey, I'm at my computer's at 7%, my battery.
Oh Lord.
So, and I'm getting hungry.
Yeah.
So,
well, we definitely need we definitely need to do a part 2 of this, because there are some other things that I wanted to touch on, specifically along the lines of the radio, the industry, as far as music goes, because I wanted to kind of get your opinion of the music industry as it, in its current state. But I kind of want to end this with, because you are, coming from that industry, and you're also an educator now, and being the social times that we're in, being on lockdown, obviously I wanted to touch on your COVID diaries that you've been doing on your Facebook. As far as, your motivation for those, and what sort of information you could give anybody listening or watching after we post this, what is your kind of advice to them about keeping communication lines open, and not, and always kind of keeping that line open and being able to properly communicate, and how important it is?
You know what? I'll share this piece of advice that my dad gave me. I think I was probably in high school or college, and my dad said, and this is really brilliant, and you have to think about it on so many levels. He said, "You're familiar with 'Don't believe everything you read.'" And I think absolutely. I may have said that. And he said, my father said to me, "Don't believe everything you think." Even if it's your opinion, you have to approach it that it's somebody else's opinion. And so I think, I don't want to engage in some of the things that happen on Facebook, where people stick to their opinion and express it as a fact, and they want to be right, and they're willing to sacrifice friendships and relationships to be right. Go ahead, you're right. Fine.
Yeah.
But, and so I think in terms of communication, it's not just talking, it's listening, and not just hearing it, but considering what it means to everybody, to whoever's saying it. And, that's the important thing, I think, even with students, because I'm the expert. I'm being paid to teach the class, but that doesn't mean the students don't have a perspective that's valid. And what I find a lot of times is, with video editing or audio production, there are steps, and this is how you do it. Step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. And invariably, there will be a student who will raise their hand and say, "Why can't I do it this way?" And I have to stop and think. And sometimes I'm like, you know what? You're right. You could do it that way. Or I'll do this a lot with video editing. I have students working in a classroom, and I'll look over somebody's shoulder and I'll be like, "Show me how you did that."
Yeah.
I didn't know you could do that. I've been teaching this software for 20 years, and I didn't know you could do that. And so I think just always being open to new information and willing to consider other information. That's it.
I think it's refreshing to hear an educator admit that they are open to learning from their students.
Oh yeah. That's the best part about my job, man. Because younger people are much more open to ideas and information. They haven't been hardened by the world. They're still trying to figure it out. They're still trying to understand what, a federal deficit is, and whether spending more money than you have is okay or not okay, or when is it okay. And so they haven't they haven't polarized their opinions to left or right. They're just somewhere in the middle, just trying to figure it out. And so they're open to ideas. And if you can meet them in the middle, there are a lot of people that say the younger people aren't as motivated or aren't as they're not as good students. They're lazier. That's not universally true. I think there are so many students that are really talented. They haven't been given a chance to show their talent or use their talent in a way that's meaningful to them. I went to school at a time where you memorized the answers and you put them on the test and everybody was proud of you. And okay, so what? I was good at memorizing things. But I think now we're in a world where you have to synthesize the information and be able to use it. And it's not just, I know a lot of stuff, because I can go to Google and find out what the population of, West Germany was right after World War II. Mm-hmm. And so I think younger people are still, they're starting to adapt to the world.
It doesn't matter what you know, it's how you apply what you know.
Right. Yeah. So finally, my final thought on communication is listen more than you talk. And even ask yourself, what proof am I willing to consider to change my mind? And if somebody starts the conversation with, go ahead and talk, but you're not going to change my mind, then don't go ahead and talk. Just go, all right, maybe when you're willing to consider other information, we can have a conversation.
As a final thought, other than the one where you call your soulmate your cellmate, what is your favorite COVID diary that you've done so far?
I don't know if I have one. It's like, which one of your fingers do you want to cut off? I don't want to lose any of my fingers. I like them all. A couple that I thought, the one about tiny houses, like, thoughts and prayers now for the people who jumped on the tiny house craze, is my wife and I are in a 1,900 square foot house. There are two of us. The house has 9 rooms. We have a big backyard. I can't imagine, like in the Bronx or Brooklyn, where there are, there's a family of 7 or 8 people in a tiny little 800 square foot apartment. So that one, just kind of popped into my head.
Were you afraid of losing your fingers when your wife saw the soulmate as a cellmate?
No, she's been pretty supportive of all of this. I think the other one that I thought was pretty ingenious was the 3 stages of quarantine, and it's related to your hair, shaggy, hippie, dreadlocks.
Which is why I'm wearing a beanie.
Yeah, I thought that one was pretty clever too, and it's becoming a little more evident every day. So those are probably my top 2. My hope is, it looks like we're going to be doing this for at least another 4 weeks. I'm hoping I can just keep it going for 4 more weeks.
Virginia's on lockdown until June 10th.
Wow. We're at May 15th. But I would expect that that's going to probably be extended to the end of May.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate this conversation. It's been a pleasure catching up with you. The next time I'm in town, I definitely want to catch up and maybe go to lunch.
Okay.
And
I like to eat.
And I do too. But and kind of why I look like a potato. Right. But I'm glad we got to do this, and I definitely hope that we can have a part 2 eventually. Maybe if the lockdown lasts any long, it'll last longer, but at some point down the line, if we're still on lockdown, we'll do this again.
Okay. Or maybe, a couple of months after, we'll see what the new normal is and compare it to our predictions.
As long as your schedule allows for it. Yeah. Because I don't want to interfere with your schedule.
All right. Well, this was fun, man. I appreciate it.
All right. I will see you soon.
Take care.
Take care.